At the end of part 1 we had found out how to make a sentience field from quantum sentience, and we asked 2 questions. What is quantum sentience? And what is the link between quantum sentience fields and the quantum fields of science, such as an electric field, a magnetic field, or an energy field? We said we needed to look at process and interfunction. Let's start with interfunction. What does Eugene Halliday say about interfunction? He says all function is interfunction. Petrol in the car interfunctioning with electrical sparks, cylinders, pistons, crankshaft, transmission, road wheels, roads, journeys, men seeing new sights, hearing new sounds, constructing new patterns of significance. Here he observes that everything is interconnected. Without the interfunctioning of everything that he has mentioned in his list, and many more that he hasn't, then a person would not be able to experience a car journey or any significance arising from it. He also says there is no function that is not interfunction, though isolating fools may believe or hope otherwise. Here he is pointing out that nothing can happen in isolation. Every act, every action, every process has to involve interfunctioning of some degree. So what about process? Importantly, we build things with processes. Let's have a look at a familiar interfunctional process. Here is a car production line. The process of building a working car requires every component of the car to be interfunctional. If any part of the car, any one of its components is missing or not connected in the appropriate way, then we no longer have a working car. And for the car to carry out its intended function, it needs to have an interfunctioning human being. So, how does all this process and interfunctionality help us to find out what quantum sentience is? We are going to find an interfunctional process that builds an interfunctional universe that has embedded interfunctional sentience. We need to start with electric quanta. Here are just a few electric quanta that make up an electric field. They are, of course, incredibly highly magnified, but we need to see what is going on. The field that we are going to look at has only negative electric charge. We will see later, when we come to build atoms, why this is a useful choice. Let's concentrate on just 2 of them. One of the first things taught at school about electric charges is that light charges repel each other. So the charges move apart until the influence of the surrounding charges reverses the direction of their motion. When they come close together, they reverse direction again. We are looking at a pair of oscillating quantum electric charges. And we can regard this as an interfunctional quantum process. We need to look very carefully at this quantum process to see what degree of interfunctionality it has. We need to pause our oscillation. So, what does this process consist of? What are its interfunctions? Clearly, the process consists of 2 quantum electric charges. But we can also appreciate that these charges are interfunctional with the quantum electric energy which provides the quantum electric force to make the quantum charges move. When the charges are moving, we have interfunctional kinetic energy. and when the charges change direction and are briefly stationary, they have interfunctional potential energy. We must not forget that the distance between the two charges is also an interfunction of the process. If there was no distance between the charges, the whole idea of the process would be meaningless. Importantly, this oscillating process cannot exist without time, so time is also an interfunction of the process. Just as with distance, if there was no interfunctional time, the idea of the process would again be meaningless. It might seem that we have exhausted the number of interfunctions that we can recognize in this process. But that is by no means the case. Some of the most important we have yet to look at. In this diagram of the same process, we have marked two boundaries. These are the points of reflection that define the extent of the process. Both reflections and boundaries are interfunctions of the process. If there were no reflections and boundaries, there would be no process. So we can add to our list of quantum interfunctions reflections and boundaries. But there are some other interfunctions within this process that are crucially important to discovering the source of quantum sentience. When we look at this quantum process, we see that in order to reflect at their specific boundaries, two electric quanta have to feel the force of all the surrounding electric quanta. They have to be aware of their surroundings. If they were not aware, there would be no reflection and no process. So we can add feeling and awareness to our list of interfunctions. Interesting to note here that in order to oscillate in the manner that it does, this vanishingly tiny process has to be aware of every other external charge in the whole universe. And our list of interfunctions hasn't finished yet. We have already noted that our quantum process is aware of the positions of both of its boundaries, so it is aware of the distance between its boundaries. So the quantum process is aware of how big it is. Well, strictly, it's aware of how long it is, but we will address 3 dimensions in a little while. We can say, therefore, that our quantum process has a property of self-awareness. And self-awareness can be added to our list of interfunctions, because if our process was not self-aware, there would be no process. We are now in a position to define quantum sentience. Earlier we took note of Eugene Halliday's idea that sentience is based on feeling, and we defined sentience as having the property of awareness and self-awareness. And we've just seen that the quantum process we are investigating has interfunctions of awareness and self-awareness. So we can conclude that importantly this quantum process has sentience as another one of its interfunctions. We will come back to this important finding shortly. But there are just a couple more interfunctions that we have missed out on that we need to address. It is a well-known property of moving charges that they are surrounded by a two-dimensional magnetic circulation. So each of our oscillating electric quanta have an interfunctional oscillating magnetic field associated with them. This is illustrated on the bottom left of the diagram. So we can add magnetism to our list of interfunctions. We now need to visualize the magnetic circulation going up and down the screen and in and out of the screen. At the same time, the electric quanta oscillate left and right across the screen. Our quantum process is operational in 3 dimensions. We conclude that 3-dimensional space is another interfunction of our quantum process. This is an amazing observation. What we are concluding here is that the quantum process that we have been looking at has an interfunction that makes 3-dimensional space. It is thought-provoking to observe that if any one of our quantum process interfunctions did not exist, then none of the other interfunctions could exist. We need to look at this further. When we said that we were going to look at reality and consciousness, we said that we were going to tackle 2 of the most basic problems in philosophy, ontology and epistemology. In considering our quantum process, we've shown that the process contains interfunctions that relate to the ontological material world, and ones that relate to epistemology, the realm of feeling, awareness, and sentience. We see that this interfunctional quantum process brings the realms of ontology and epistemology together. This is an extremely important result from this analysis, because there is now a possibility of using our quantum process to develop a comprehensive model of the universe that unites reality and consciousness. We will find this diagram useful for moving forward. The central grey circle represents what we call the master interfunctional reflexive process. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it sums up the idea that all the interfunctions are contained within it. In this particular diagram, we have exploded just 6 of the interfunctions that we discovered. The interconnecting lines represent the fact that no interfunction can exist unless all the others exist. If any interfunction fails, the whole process fails. So, for instance, we can see that quantum space, the very 3 dimensions in which we exist, cannot exist without quantum sentience, and quantum sentience cannot exist without quantum space. The master interfunctional quantum field is the umbrella under which all the other quanta can be gathered. But why reflexive? Particularly, why reflexive spelt with an X? There are 2 reasons. Reflexive reminds us that our quantum process is very much one of reflection with a CT, but the X signifies that this process is much more than a reflective process, because it contains elements of feeling, awareness, and sentience. Later on, we will see another good reason. In his book Reflexive Self-Consciousness, Eugene Halliday explains the importance of reflexive thinking. But this is for later in the series. So now we need to ask what happens when we build a field from our master quantum reflexive process. Earlier we showed that we can build any quantum field we like just by changing the label. And we looked at an example of changing a diagram of a blue field represented by a disk into a diagram of a sentience field represented by a disk. So here, in the center, we are looking at a disk representing a master reflexive process field, built from reflexive process quanta. The beauty of this diagram is that we can also see, in this case, 6 other quantum fields surrounding the central disk. They are interfunctional with the master reflexive process field. And just as in the case with single quanta, no field can exist without all the others. If we want to show that our fields are infinite in extents, we can show this by adding outward pointing arrows. We are now illustrating infinite universal interfunctional reflexive process fields. This is rather cumbersome, so from now on we will refer to these fields just by name. So we will refer to them as an energy field, a space field, a sentient field, and so on. And similarly to the case when we look at single quanta, the interconnecting lines here represent the fact that no field can exist unless all the other fields exist. If any field fails, the whole system fails. Now there are many interfunctions and many connections between them. But for our purposes, we are going to concentrate on just 2 fields and the connection between them. We are going to look at the connection on the right hand side between the sentience field and the space field. This connection is illustrating that space cannot exist without sentience, and conversely, sentience is an integral part of space. It is worth repeating what I have just said. Sentience is an integral part of space, and space cannot exist without sentience. This relationship is of crucial importance. It opens up the possibility of seamlessly building consciousness into the physical universe. In Part 3, Atoms and Light, we will first look at building the physical universe.